how the left left behind the class struggle to embrace gender ideology. He's been fighting for this topic since then, and he's very audacious, and he is free to speak. So you have the floor, Agustín, whenever you will.
Me dicen solo un detalle, y es que las tarjetitas para las preguntas.
As we said, the cards for your questions are inside your bag, so please go ahead and use them. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. First and foremost, I would like to thank the authorities of Azteoid for having taken me into account to deliver this brief presentation in this prestigious conference together with such recognized speakers from across the world. As a political scientist, I've been asked to try to explain the origin of gender ideology in political sciences. And this is not a secondary matter now. It's actually a core matter. What we want to do is to conceive political strategy against gender ideology. I have put together a PowerPoint presentation. I don't know whether it's available. I'll just stand still for a second to see if it's displayed on the screen. There it is. Thank you. The idea that I would like to present to you today is that gender ideology is not autonomous. What I mean by this is that this is not an ideology that has created itself from the political standpoint. It doesn't arise from the warmth of political masses that try to reconfigure terminological terms to endow some sense to their struggle. Nevertheless, this gender ideology term has been created in university labs, actually decades ago. But I will try to focus on the origin of that gender ideology in the first part of my talk so that we can better understand one of the main sides of it, or prongs, which is politics. I think we can divide the left into two categories: the old left, the one that we had since Marx until the end of the Cold War, and then the new left that arose from the revolutions that took place in the 60s and that shows its effect on today's world. From the old left to the new left, what transitions are there? What are transitions that have taken place? Well, I think that there's three transitions in terms of social theory, in the sense of history of philosophy, and the revolutionary strategy. And I will try to elaborate on this with greater depth now. What did Marx and Engels say about society, and what way of conceiving society was in place there that enlightened the old left to proceed to understand society as they did? These are the excerpts that I have chosen. In the prologue of our social contribution to political economy, it's not the awareness of men that determines its being, but quite the opposite. It's the social being that determines its conscience. When we change the economic base, then all the superstructure erected on it is transformed. This is the base of Marxist thoughts, because it establishes the way in which society is conceived in Marxism. Classic Marxism perceived society as if it were a two-story building. Let's see it from this standpoint. We have a two-story building. On the first floor, we have the infrastructure of the economic base, and the second floor is called the superstructure. Here you have a graph to illustrate it. What is this economic base and the superstructure, that first floor of that social building? Well, Marx said that at the base we find everything that's real, everything that's materially real and tangible. Economy, labor force, production relationships, and on top of that, we see a set of irrealities that they came to call superstructure. And culture, religion, philosophy, art, politics, moral right, all those are encompassed there. I would like to ask you if we all agree on conceiving society from this angle, from the angle of this building that we see on the graph. And we had the mission to blow up the society. Where would you put the bomb? First floor or second floor? First floor, right? Bottom floor. Because if you put your bomb on the second floor, then the first floor could be completely intact, and the owners of the base floor, who own economy, would reconstruct it after the explosion. It's important to take into account these concepts regarding society because they actually generate a revolutionary strategy. And my PowerPoint is a bit off track, but anyhow. On the other hand, on the old left, they perceived history quite specifically. They talk about the subjects of revolution. We know that the way society is composed, if we want to destroy it, we want to cause a revolution at the production at the means of production level, so that we can have a revolution amongst the means of production. But who needs to do that? Who is called to do that? That's one of the greatest questions that the old left asked itself. And they went on to call this the revolutionary subject, the subject of a revolution. Another problem was to see when that revolution could take place. Can we foresee this revolution? We need to be ready for when the revolution comes. Look at what Marx and Engels wrote in the Communist Manifesto. This is the history of the class struggle. The class struggle is the subject of history. What are social classes? Well, social classes are groups that are defined by their relationship with the economic system. Bourgeoisie against labor forces, the capitalist period that Marx and Engels wrote about. The history of societies is the history of class struggles. The world of our society makes progress in line with this type of struggle, the class struggle, the economic struggle. This philosophy of this philosophy gave rise to an approach to history in which everything happens on the base of stages. We had slavery, then the class struggle led to feudalism, then to capitalism, and then socialism, which is the latest class struggle, which is the one that brought about the end of history. Crises arise when production relationships halt the development of productive forces. These are terms that have to do with political philosophy, but you will see in a second where I'm coming from. What I wanted to illustrate here is that the old left was all about the class struggle, the economic struggle, the struggle to dismantle what we went on to call the first floor of that social building that we illustrated earlier, which is what made the second floor makes sense, the superstructure. And this philosophy is even prophetic in a way. Marx and Engels say that bourgeoisie produces, amongst everything, its own undertakers. This strategy, this philosophy of history, this gave rise to a revolutionary strategy known by everybody, which is possibly part of history, illustrated by thinkers and personalities like the ones that we see on the slide. But what is the new left? Because that's the old left. That already failed. The wall went down in the year 1999. The Soviet Union imploded in December 1991, finally. So after the Second World War, we started to envisage that the Western world started to lead a better life than the East, and then Marxist thinkers started writing from failure. As it happened on the 17th in Russia, they started to reconsider what was going on. We have thinkers such as Gramsci, who wrote from jail after having foreseen that the revolution had to come to Italy, a socialist type of revolution. Having seen what had happened in Russia, he thought that that had to get to Italy because of the laws of Marxist history. Nevertheless, it didn't get there because Mussolini came around and put him in jail. So this is a thinker that was writing from failure to reorganize thinking that would make a revolution possible in the Eastern world, in the Western world, sorry. In the Frankfurt School, all the things happened, similar things happened. They started taking on all the types of paradigms that were completely unrelated to Marxism. For instance, Freud and psychoanalysis. They started taking up ideas from Heidelberg or Nietzsche, and they started to realize that that superstructure is the second floor of that building, and it is more important than they had originally thought. They went on to write in books such as Authority and Family that was published in the year 36, a book that states that family is an institution that's halting in the Western world the labor force revolution because their parents socialize their children and they teach them to live under capitalism. We need to position ourselves essentially to understand the new left, which is the midwife of gender ideology. We need to set ourselves in the historical backdrop, and that historical backdrop is that of the 60s. What happened in the 60s? Imagine that you live in the post-World War II world. Those countries of the first world, as they call them in Latin America, they started growing at a very fast pace. This time was called the Golden Era of Capitalism at the global level. Countries grew until the year 1973 at a 5% rate, and their GDP grew at 5%. Marx said that the labor force had nothing to lose but their own shackles. But people started having in their homes TVs, and today's we would say also telephones. What happens when that's something that you have to lose too? What happens when the labor force has that to lose too? Well, the revolution becomes impossible, at least in terms of classes, because the labor force was absorbed back then by the system that it supposedly had to face. There were changes in social stratification, qualitative and quantitative changes. The service sector started breaking in. White-collar workers and employees also started to be more prominent. It was increasingly less necessary to use physical strength for working. Working hours started to decrease. There were many changes among working classes that shaped up the world in a very different manner, very different to what Marx had seen when he was writing. We were in a different type of history, a different stage of history. The working class was no longer willing to change the world, but he was rather more concerned about getting a new car. And what did the new left do when this happened? Well, the subject of the revolution no longer wanted to heed them. The prophecy was not going to materialize. Then they moved on from the class struggle to the cultural struggle. The same dialectics that applied to divide men in terms of their economic relationships started to operate in the field of culture to fragment other fields. And there appeared gender ideology. And there appeared other ideologies that are also very important and that are serving the purposes of the new left. Multiculturalism, environmentalism, penal guaranteeism. Things that went to show that there was the end of history, as mentioned by Francis Fukuyama. Please recall what happened in May in 1968. Who went out to the street on the revolution of May 68? Was that the working class on the street? No, it was students. The working class joined a week later, and as soon as the government gave in to some economic demands, then they retreated. But students kept on writing things on the walls. Artists, intellectuals, revolutionary intellectuals were at the forefront of these demonstrations of students. At the bottom it says, let's be realistic, let's ask for the impossible. What does this lyrical utopia have to do with Marx's philosophy? With that all left that was asking the impossible, not just the impossible, they were also asking that what historical materialism had anticipated, and because it didn't materialize, they had to continue on asking for it. The impossible didn't materialize and will not materialize. Then the left loses touch with what intended to be a social science. Look at this, imagination is power. What does that have to do with the working class? Of course, because this is an intellectual revolution. This is not an intellectual revolution for social classes. This is an intellectual revolution. The gender ideology is not a product of social masses. Imagination in power. This is Cordoba, by the way, in the year 1968. This is a student revolution that was important in the US and in France too, but it had an impact across the globe actually, and this gave rise to a change in paradigm. This is the landmark that perhaps inaugurates postmodern society. The father of this theory is the man that we see on slide, Herbert Marcuse. Here you can see some of his statements. Actually, I extracted this from a few of his texts. This opposition targets the totality of a prosperous society that works well, in contrast with the revolution in previous stages in history. Apparently, even if society works, we have to change it no matter what, because that's why we are the left. Because when you visit the tombstone of Marx in London, well, you will see on his grave is one of his most important theses. It's about that the philosophers have tried to explain the world, but it's all about changing it. But what happens if society is prosperous? Why would we have to change it? Because we need to create new conflicts and fragmentate new categories, create new struggles. And this is what gender ideology has given to these people. Some of his statements by Herbert Marcuse are very interesting. We face a new historical situation because today we have to get rid of a society that works relatively well because it's wealthy and powerful. The problem that we face is about the need for liberation. It is not about a poor society that isn't disintegrated. And in many occasions, we don't even talk about a terrorist society, but rather about a society that develops to a great scale the cultural needs of men as well as the material. A society where we need to use the motto, distribute merchandise amongst an increasingly bigger portion of society. What does this have to do with Marx's thinking? He had announced that revolution was unavoidable because in capitalism, the working class was going to lead a worse life. But what happens if their life is increasingly better? They assume reality and they say, okay, let's change the strategy. The working class no longer wants to see us or heed us. We need to come up with new types of conflict so that we can get some dynamics here. And here we come to one of his most important works, Eras and Civilization. Here they talk about that social revolution. It keeps on talking about thinkers from the Frankfurt School, such as Wilhelm Reich, who had already participated in the sexual revolution years before. But Marcuse adds a new tone of philosophical nature. The notion of an instinctive order that is non-repressive must be proved in the most disorderly, quote-unquote, of all instincts, sexuality. What does he mean by non-repressive instinctive order? And listen to this equation. It's not easy to understand it. He says, when things are scarce, we have to work. Because we lack something, we have to work. And this introduces us into what Freud would call the reality principle. In order to live, we have to work. In capitalism, we have had abundance, but a bad redistribution that forces us to keep on working. But now he says, what would happen if the socialist distribution of that abundance, that's to say, if after capitalism, socialism were to redistribute, and if we add to that an automation of the productive system and a centralized planning as the one that he saw they had in the Soviet Union. Well, if this happens, there will be less work. He calls this the desublimation. Sexual energies displaced to the labor area goes back to the sexual order. Well, this has to do with psychoanalysis. But the big problem for Herbert Marcuse is that he assumes that socialism doesn't work as well as capitalism in economic terms. He knew that if the socialist revolution went to North America, North Americans were going to lead a worse life. But if that were to be the reality, then what would we have to do? Well, we need to change humans, because maybe humans don't want to lead a worse life in order to have sexual freedom. And there appears the idea of sexual revolution linked up to social revolution, because it's impossible to have Fidel Castro and the guerrilla war with the rifles and guerrilla techniques. Well, if we are not going to have that, then maybe we should try to change men. In what terms? In sexual terms, because if we want to come up with a new instinctive regime, as Marcuse says, then we need to start working on sexuality. See how he closes the circle that he himself opens in this thesis. Let's talk about gender ideology now, because until now I've been trying to explain the political foundations. We're talking about the 50s. We are talking about something that has been in place for a very long time. Ideas lead to consequences, especially when they become academic and they become mainstream. The origin of gender ideology lies in gender feminism. Let's try to conceptualize this, quoting some of the thinkers that belong to this trend. Simone de Beauvoir, she was a thinker, she was a Sartre's couple, and she wrote The Second Sex, one of the most important books on this matter. Just yesterday I went to some libraries and I saw that it was showcased on all stands. It's sold as if it was a book released yesterday, but it's a book that was written over 70 years ago. This book became immortal because of a sentence that gives it a very remarkable motto. Gives a remarkable motto to current feminism. She said, "You are not born a woman, you get to be one." Please imprint in your memory the quotations that I'm raising from these authors, because this will allow us to conceptualize gender ideology, because it's essential to know by heart what we say when we talk about gender ideology. Kate Millett from the US in the 70s. What's personal, it's political, she said. How authoritarian and totalitarian, actually, is this sentence? This was part of privacy, but what's personal is part of privacy. It lies within the spheres of civil society. And she considers that political, we consider that what's political shouldn't be personal, but what happens when what's personal is political? We allow the state to be legitimate, to have legitimacy to arrange our personality. This is quite totalitarian, and this quotation is very important because it lies at the root of the philosophical discourse of this type of ideologists. Monique Wittig from France, she has many essays. Heterosexual thinking is one of her essays, and she directly says that women do not exist. Simone de Beauvoir said, "We are not born a woman, but you get to be one." But she says that women do not exist, and you may wonder why a feminist theoretical professional could want to eliminate the existence of the political subject that defines feminism. It's as if Marx said that in reality the working class didn't exist. But she's very smart, because if women do not exist, then we can establish hegemonic bonds between feminism and LGBT militants. And on the 8th of March, we could be seeing transsexuals, women, and all sorts of people marching on the streets. And indeed, we do see that. But why does she say that women do not exist? She says that they do not exist because lesbians, in a way, challenge the binary approach. The political subject, as Monique Wittig evidences that women do not exist. And she says that the sex category is the byproduct of the heterosexual society that imposes on women the absolute obligation to reproduce the species. That is to say, reproducing heterosexual society. Vitic didn't have any children. I don't see why she says that there's an obligation to continue reproduce them for the species. And she says its sole existence this also goes to challenge that women don't exist. Also, we have Judith Butler. She's the vedette of gender ideology in the current world. She's not from France. She's from California. And her most important book is Gender in Dispute, released in the 90s. And what she says is summarized in one sentence. Sex always was gender, with the result of the distinction between sex and gender not existent as such. What does this mean? Because until that point, we had heard that I only have 5 minutes. They had told us until that point that society was divided between biological sex and the cultural aspects of sex. But now she directly says that in reality, sex always was gender. I'm going to skip the quotation about transsexual, but the political subject that we're discussing here is the transsexual. But here we're talking about the most important authors of feminism. And Beatriz Preciado, by the way, is Spanish, but I'm going to skip that because I'm running out of time. But this takes us to the issue of what is gender ideology. Let's follow the footprints, the clues. You're not a woman, you get to be one. What's personal, it's political. In reality, sex was always gender. So what is gender ideology then? Well, gender ideology, in short, is a set of anti-scientific ideas that, with a political purpose that is totalitarian and linked to the ideological project of the New Left, they unroot this human society from its nature to explain it through culture. Sexually, we no longer are what we are in biological terms, but rather in cultural terms. And because there's an oppressive society that creates our constructs, then apparently these people have an antidote for this, which is self-perception. That means that I am what I perceive I am. And I have no problem with people who perceive that they are something that they're not. That's important. You have a right to do that, and I stand for that. You have a right to dress up and play carnival. I have no problem with that. If Ignacio, for instance, wants to dress up as Superman and tell us that he is Superman and he wants to jump off the 10th floor to see if he can fly, that's his problem, not my problem. When does that become my problem? When Ignacio asks me to fund his cape and forces me to perceive him as the Superman that he isn't. There's no gender ideology without totalitarianism. There is no gender ideology without statesmanship. This actually needs the oppressive power of the states to be implemented. And this is why gender ideology always begins from the state, and it needs the state to become something bigger than a group of people that are self-deceiving themselves. I don't know how much time I have left. I'm going to go over this as fast as I possibly can. They had asked me to talk about the possibilities of political reactions to this. What would happen if, if the New Left is at the base of this gender ideology? Could we come up with a right in our countries? Could we conceive a possibility of having a new right? Well, the right also has a few problems, and I'm going to go over this quickly because time is pressing, but later on we can elaborate on this during the Q&A.
For instance, take a look at the old right, which is what we have currently with Pepe, Macri in my country, Bier in Chile, and so on. They always believed in the end of history, and they keep on fighting somehow in a paradoxical way against the Cold War. And for them, if the economy is more or less a market economy, if capitalism more or less works, the rest they don't care about. They have no intellectuals among them. They're technologists and technicals. It's just the economy that they like, and they let the left colonize them because they haven't studied these topics, so they think that culture does not exist. And they said that it was the economy, you stupid, but now in a postmodern world, we would have to say it's the culture, stupid, because it's the culture which gives us the clear idea and sets the values. Too many technical people, too few intellectuals. They say that they're not right-handed politicians, and on the other hand, we have leftists proclaiming that they are of the left, although they have killed millions of people in the 20th century. It makes no sense, and they are out of history. We need a new right, and there are reasons why we can be hopeful. That's why I'm asking 2 more minutes so that I can close. We have available our communication revolution, Web 2.0, which has been a non-precedented communication revolution. We can now not just read a newspaper with a message that comes from the paper to us without return. Now it's not just one-way communication. Now it's a 2-way communication. Currently, we can write our own blogs. We can make our own TV emissions through YouTube. If we don't like an article by a journalist, we don't have to stay home insulting him. We can write to them through Twitter. We can create mass opinion thanks to this tool. And 2007, it says that 6.2% of the world population was connected in a social network. In 2012, 82% of the people who were connected at internet were entering a social network. This is a very important tool that we have available. This progressivism is now being weakened. They had revolutionized the youth because they allowed them to fight against the establishment. But what happens when progressivism is the establishment? When we think as a lefty, it's just status quo. Many youngsters are starting to rebel because this is needed for them. They need to be rebellious, and they realize that being lefty is not rebellious. Having just a Che Guevara T-shirt is marketing, and it's not being rebellious. Now, being rebellious could be wearing a Donald Trump T-shirt. The worse, the better was a sentence used by the guerrillas in Latin America. What did that mean? It meant that when the repression of the state was bigger against them, then the people would see the contradiction and would support the guerrilla. So this logic that didn't work because the people helped the armed forces, but we have to think about that. I would have wondered what would have happened with the orange bus if nothing had happened, if there hadn't been a state repression. Now, just some people would have seen it in the streets, but since a prosecutor prevented them from joining traffic, the worse, the best, the more we are under attack, the stronger we will become. And I have a last point, and if you'll allow me, I would like to share it with you all. Could we show the PowerPoint so that we can close my presentation? Oh, no PowerPoint. Okay. No, you don't want me to go on? Okay. It is. Okay. Well, I just wanted to send one last hopeful message. I am traveling through Latin America. I always had a very old audience. My public was always very old. I published 5 books. And during these last 2 years, with this last book I published, something amazing happened. 70% of my audience is under 30 years of age. They're under 30. The youngsters are now realizing that there is a lie flying about, and they want to end this silence loop that is making us be unaware of the fact that we are the majority. We do not realize that we are the majority because minority positions from the academia and so on have told us that we are thinking things wrong, that we come from an older time, that we are out of the cavern. So we are with our colleagues, and when we talk about these topics with our colleagues at work, we never say what we mean and what we think because we don't want to offend anyone. But maybe around that table, everyone thought like we do, and they all were silent. So we have to end this spiral of silence. We have to be politically incorrect. We have to do it because it is something that is contagious, and we have to show people that public opinion is not the same thing as published opinion. Public opinion is the opinion of the public in general, and published opinion is the opinion of those who have the power to publish their opinion because they have the means to do it. And public opinion, when it is expressed in the streets, like it's happening in many countries in Latin America, say no to gender ideology. Thank you very much.
Bueno, como ya les dije, no iba a dejar.
As I told you, he was not going to leave you cold, and he does not mince his words. So the talk went from a very light perspective to a stronger one. You're saying that the objective of the new left is to transform society, but in what direction? What's their objective? Because in this description of social engineering, that's clear. So why are they doing it? What for? Listen, if there is something that really makes the difference between the old left and the new left, is that the old left had a political program. They at least wanted to theorize what sort of institutions the communist world would have, for instance. But what happens with the new left is that that is broken, and any possibility of theorizing a world, a post-capitalistic world, a new left, is going against the imagination, which is in the epistemological base of this new left. Remember one of the graffitis I showed? Imagination should be holding the power. When we have the power, we will imagine what it is that we want for our society. If the left is just a force of destruction, then it is nothing as a strength of construction to build things, and they know that very well. That is why today they don't even have the need that they had in the old times of thinking about a new society. Thinking about a new society nowadays is just holding on to the current regime, and that is how they protect themselves when we ask them, what is your proposal? They know very well how to destroy the society, but they don't know what they want for the new society. Yes, they're very successful destroying values to the extent that saying something as obvious as that the girls have a vagina and the boys have a penis, it seems to be a criminal offense. How come this has penetrated so much into society? How come this gender ideology has penetrated societies in a violent way even? Well, a couple of things. These people come from what I would call the cultural factories. These cultural factories of of modern society, which are universities. In universities, we configure our culture, and everything that belongs to our culture comes from universities. And universities have the power, have the power, and they are completely polluted by gender ideology. And their political groups are very well organized. They are articulated in a way that would, for instance, enter a trend topic in Twitter in a matter of seconds. People actually pay to have a trending topic. And these people are so well articulated that they will say at 2 in the afternoon, we will all be using this hashtag, for instance, the one today. And they will generate a trending topic. And that's how they create opinion, public opinion. And that's how they generate the feeling and the lie that if you don't think as they do, then you live in the old days. And this is important, and I think that we should take a minute to think about this, and I would like to explain it. The big lie of progressism or progressists is to establish time as a moral and epistemological criteria. What does this mean? They said that which is new, that is a novelty, is necessarily better than the previous things and is necessarily truer than the previous things. That is why they tell you, oh, you have old ideas. Oh, you think like people of coming from the olden days. But what's your name, Luis? If I were to tell you, Luis, I have 2 cell phones behind my back. You cannot see them. And one was built in 2007 and the other one built in 2018. Which one would you choose? 2018. Why? Because technology is progressing with time. But if I were to tell you, I have two books that I could offer to you. One is from the 3rd century, and the other one was published this year. I'm guessing that the situation complicates itself because you would be missing out on Aristotle or Plato instead of reading Osho. So the ideas are not necessarily better because they're new, and they're not truer because they're new. We have to end with that lie. The truth has no time. It's simply true. You've talked a lot about social networks and the penetration that they have and the capacity that we have to work in them. Nonetheless, some people ask themselves, since we are playing in our enemies' field because Facebook and Twitter are being boycotted by them, that they tweet everything and they're very successful and we're not as successful. Why is that? Are we lazy? Do we work? No, is our work method bad? No, I think that this is a guerrilla war, but in the 21st century. How did the guerrilla act? Well, I have studied against terrorism, so I know terrorism very well. So guerrillas used rules that were irregular in their fighting because they knew that they were weaker than the others. So why are we weaker than the armies of gender ideologists? We don't have the financing, the multinational financing. We don't have the support of the UN. We don't have the support of Ford, Bill Gates, or Rockefeller. We are partisans in our century, and our jungle is a social network, and there, as snipers, we launch our attacks. Now, very often social networks, which are also controlled by gender ideology, will cancel our accounts for a month, for 2 weeks. That happens to me once a month. Once a month, they cancel my account. So what do? I have 3 different Facebook accounts, 1 Twitter account, 1 Instagram account, and I have to start working with the other one. So when they cancel one of my accounts, I use the others. We mustn't get out of the social network. Some people say, no, I will just leave the social networks because they're censoring my publications, so they're worthless. No, it's the only mechanism that we currently have to try and go beyond those impossible barriers that they have created for us, which are the traditional media. In Argentina 10 years ago, people said that in average people would be watching TV 4 hours a day. Now it's just 1 hour a day. And why is that? Because Argentinians don't like TV? No, it's because we have 6 different screens to be connected online. We have our tablet, our laptop, our desktop computer, our cell phone, etc., etc. So we go from one thing to the next, and we're online. We mustn't get out of social networks, no matter what. It is our battling position. Okay, you've talked about Rockefeller. What does the new left have to do with Rothschild, Kissinger, and other benefactors? Is this a revolution or an industry? Well, both. There is an industry, a multi-billion dollar industry. Planned Parenthood, for instance. Planned Parenthood is promoting and financing LGBT lobbies, feminists, etc. in all of our Latin American countries. I'm talking about my situation. They finance it. Why? Because they want them to pressure for abortion laws. Why does Planned Parenthood need for abortions to be approved? Because it's a business, because we know that it is a business. And now they have the hormone business. People see it as a business, and some people see it as an ideology and as a political crusade. I think that Soros, who donates 80% of his business to his foundation Open Society, what is the dividend? What is the profitability of investing 80% of your fortune to finance LGBTs? I think that this is really arrogant, really. I would say that this is the arrogance of those who think that they have the power, that they can change man and society. And he is a person who is really behind this. So I think that there is a side that is ideologists like Soros, and then another side which is the one financing, which is money, which is Planned Parenthood. There is a priest who who says that this ideology is against Christ, and what's the role of the church in all of this? Benedict said that gender ideology was the last revolution of man against God. It is very important for the church to be a part of this. They need to take a stand. I'm going to say something that is politically incorrect, especially for an Argentinian. I am not seeing that the Vatican is really taking a stand with the strength that is needed in this fight against this. And I think that there are many priests who are afraid of speaking out. And I have actually had I've been invited by a very brave bishop in Arequipa in Peru in order to have a course, 5 days, 2 times a day for some priests. And unfortunately, the interest was not great. I mean, the participation was just 4 or 5 people a day. So it is important, very important for bishops to take a stand. And the topic needs to be tackled by the church, because Protestants are doing it very well. For instance, in Latin America, with my children, Don't Play With My Children is an evangelic movement that is fighting gender ideology. So the Catholic Church needs to be present, and they need to have the people come out to the streets to show politicians what our stand is. We need to understand that in a democratic system, as a political fight, society needs to give signs to those who represent us. And if we don't give those signs, then the media will give it. How do you give a sign to those who represent you? Well, by demonstrating. Do you think that the right has allowed for the left to have the cultural power with this economicist discourse, and the church as well in Latin America has allowed for evangelists to be fighting the fight in the streets? Yes, absolutely. With regards to the right, we have lots of think tanks that only talk about economy, and economy is very good. I mean, economy needs to work. Market economy is much better than socialism, no doubt about it. But socialism is not just put in practice with Che Guevara. It's also put in practice with these demonstrations, these LGBT feminist demonstrations that are ripping society into, and that are that are fighting against the cultural, the basis of a free economy. Economy is completely linked with the culture, and that's the culture that we are losing. And that is why it is important for liberals as well. Those who want less presence of the state need to realize that there isn't gender ideology without a bigger state, and that's the big business as well. We were talking about industry a few moments ago. As a politologist, I know very well that you go to your universities, law and social sciences universities, to become a bureaucrat. You are taught how to be a part of the state because they tell you that the market can't offer anything. Sociology, for instance, how many sociologists can live their life as researchers and writers? No, they end up in a public institution. So what does gender ideology give these people? An economic interest, because they know that the more gender ideology will be, more positions will there be, more bureaucracy will there be for them. So there are all of these intertwined interests and ideals that are very difficult to unfold. So people always have wanted to be a part of the budget, and some people say that if you don't have a budget, then it's ridiculous. Do you think that the right should be a part of this budget? Well, it depends. What for? If you tell me more budget for maintaining Spain's frontiers and security, I would say, well, that's the state function, to have a budget so that you can have security armed forces to fight crime. Then I'd say, yes, great, that is a function of the state. But if you tell me, and apparently this happens in Spain, being a part of the budget to finance hormonal treatments and surgery treatments of the wrongly called sex change, because this is a terminology war as well. You cannot change war. You can obviously cut your genitalia, and that's great. If you want to do it. But there are two things. Do not tell me that it's a sex change, and do not use my taxes to do it. Let me tell you a case that happened in Sweden. I don't know if you know it, so that you know what gender ideology can be, and it has to do with the budget as well. Do you know that in Sweden, the left party is now asking for a law to force men to peace sitting down? It means that they want gender equality even in the bathroom. But if we think it through, this would be inefficient by nature. It cannot be applied, because not even if 60% of the parliament votes for, they cannot enforce it, because in order to enforce that law, it would mean that we would have to have cameras in our bathrooms or have a policeman looking at us when we pee, because otherwise they don't know if we would be in breach of the law or not. So it's not really about enforcing the law, but rather establishing a discourse where men and women are not complementary. We are enemies, and that enmity would also be seen when peeing. So wherever you see these things, there's always money. Any gender initiative has public money. Yes, that's why I was asking you. Maybe we are not talking about an industry. They have simply called a new market niche that is connected to the budget. It's not really an ideological project, because I still don't understand what someone would get from destroying human beings or for creating an anthropology that they know is wrong and false. I will tell you that left is the atheist religion of socially resented. Some people have ideologized their frustrations, and in the social sense, there will always be people like those. There will always be the left. Now it's gender ideology. Tomorrow it could be something else. It was the fight of classes yesterday. So I would tell you that some see it as an industry, and some obviously have simply a frustration and have their own internal psychological conflicts, and they are politicizing and creating ideologies to cover their own frustrations. If we take a look at the personal lives of the people I mentioned, we will see that there are clear explanations of why they wrote what they wrote. So you think it is a problem of personal frustration or unbalance, that psychological imbalances of these intellectuals. If you have a problem, imagine. No one can achieve everything that they want. Failure is something that has to happen to human beings. Even Messi, I come from Argentina, he has failed. We didn't win the World Cup. Even Messi failed. He didn't win the World Cup. But before failure, you have two options. You can either understand the context that took you to that failure and then do some self-criticism and say, well, I didn't do this well, I didn't do that well. Or, for instance, I set up a supermarket and I failed. I went chapter 11. Maybe my prices were too high or my prices were too low. Maybe the location wasn't right. So when you think that way, you tend to improve as a human being because you learn. You learn from that failure for the next case. So, but what happens if someone from the left tells you, no, if you failed with your supermarket is because American capitalism has screwed you. Now put your Che Guevara shirt on and come with us. For instance, I have a sexual problem with my identity. Let's say I have a sexual problem with my identity. I could solve it or accept it in a healthy way, or I have an unhealthy way of dealing with this, and people tell me, you have no problem whatsoever with your sexuality. It's hetero-capitalists and Catholic Church who are pressuring you, so just come and take some excrement and throw it to your priest. So social resentment will always be there, and people who don't like self-criticism are open to being perverted by other people so that they can somehow fight for their frustration. So there will always be people fighting for the left, so we have to disarm them. So this conference is very important in that sense. Really, those discourses that are very understandable, people who have a problem and would rather not have it and so on, has managed to be so present in society in general, because everything that happened after the bus, the orange bus and the pressure and so on, many people came to the streets, but less people than we would have expected when there was an attack against freedom of expression, because we said what's basic, which is 2 + 2 is 4. How come such an obvious lie, such a clear mistake? like saying that it is a sin to say that boys have a penis. How come that doesn't make people just stand up and come to the streets? Yes, it's impressive. That is the consequence of an engineering, a social engineering that has been going on for decades. For instance, take a look at the boys who were demonstrating here. How old were they? 15, 16, 17? I have been, I receive a death threat every day. And I always try to get into the profile of those who threaten me, and they're usually 15, 16 years old. They have Justin Bieber as their profile photo, and then they have the message, let's kill all machists, for instance. So what's terrible about this revolution is that it goes centimeter by centimeter. It cannot be heard, and supposedly it's painless. But what really is being impacted and what really is being killed is our brains. And when the brain is fried, because we cannot see the process, we cannot see how they got to have a fried brain. They're just boys who didn't want us to say that women have a vagina and men have a penis, and any biologist would confirm it. And if they weren't to confirm that, I wouldn't want to see that doctor.
Muy bien. Bueno, lo vamos a...
Okay, we are going to leave it here. We're going to leave it at that. We will have a coffee break. It'll last 30 minutes, 30 German minutes. So I want you back in 30 minutes time, okay? And they're also telling me that we are going to take our family picture now at the photo call. So I will ask all the speakers to come here so that we can take that picture. Thank you very much.